I'm going to have Chip Carter come and tell you about a great soul.
I want to welcome all of you here and thank you for coming to help my family and to mourn with my family and mostly to celebrate a life well lived. My mother was the glue that held our family together through the ups and downs and thicks and thins of our family's politics. As individuals, she believed in us and took care of us. When I was 14, I supported President Johnson for president. And every day I wore a Johnson sticker on my shirt. And periodically I would get beat up and my shirt torn and the buttons pulled off and my sticker always destroyed. And I would walk the block during lunch from school down to Carter's warehouse, and my mother would have a shirt in a drawer, already mended, button sewn on, and the LBJ sticker still applied. Years later, she was influential in getting me into rehab for my drug and alcohol addiction. She saved my life. When I started making speeches for Dad in his political career, I was so nervous I often vomited in the waiting room before we went on stage. And one day, after debating 7 other children of offspring of candidates for president, I called my mother and told her how nervous I got. And she told me something that I have used 1,000 times since. She said, "Chip, you can do anything for 20 minutes except hold your breath." When I was in the 2nd grade at Plains High School, they had a donkey basketball game in the stadium, in the school building there, to raise money for the school. And my mother rode her donkey as fast as it would slowly go, right under the goal, spun around so she was facing its tail, caught the pass, and made the winning 2 points. She was my hero that night, and she's been my hero ever since. A couple of years ago, Mom and I were talking when she said that when Dad asked her to marry her for the 2nd time, she said yes. But she expected him to provide for her a life of adventure. He told her that it would happen. She told me that she had lived on both coasts in Hawaii while I was in the Navy and began her family. Mom said that when it was decided they would leave the Navy and move back to Plains, that she was upset. And the family story is that they rode in a car from Connecticut to Plains, Georgia, and when Mom had something to say to Dad, she would say, "Jack, would you tell your father?" When Dad ran for office the first time, my mother ended up running Carter's warehouse. She loved it. Every time he'd go on a campaign trip or during the legislative session, she was really pleased to be in the office and be the boss. Excuse me. She told me that when Dad started running for president, that the thing that she enjoyed the most were the people that she met across the country. And that from working in Carter's warehouse, she said, I was able to speak the languages and prices and yields and relate to everyday issues in farm families, especially in Iowa. She said because of that, she's the one that helped win that election there. Then, as First Lady of the United States, always trying to follow the teaching of Jesus and to do what he taught her to do as a guideline, she said, you will always get criticized by somebody for everything you do. So you might as well do what's right. That she and Dad were able to make a positive difference in people's lives, and that of so many families too. My parents' 77-year partnership is often talked about. Mom was always well informed on the issues of the day. In the White House, Mom asked Dad so many questions that he finally said that she should attend cabinet meetings. So she did, and caught a lot of flack for that. But she was then able to speak with authority on issues across our country and the world. She would often try and often fail to get Dad to do what was right politically. And when she couldn't change Dad's mind, she would repeat to herself, "A leader takes people where they want to go. A great leader takes people where they need to go." Losing the election in 1980 was devastating to us all. My parents were still young, my mother only 53, and they knew they still had more to contribute. They decided they would become missionaries and spent months trying to decide how to accomplish their goal. Finally, they decided as partners to start the Carter Center, which would allow my mother to continue to fight the stigma of mental illness and allow them both to help the poorest of the poor on this earth, as Jesus had taught them. Mom started the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers at Georgia Southwestern University to train and support those who help others. At the same time, Mom and Dad continued to support Habitat for Humanity, and Mom continued to support the Friendship Force. She told me that her adventures had led her to more than 120 countries. She had been fly fishing all over the world. She had met kings and queens, presidents, others in authority, powerful corporate leaders and celebrities. She said the people that she felt the most comfortable with and the people she enjoyed being with the most were those that lived in absolute abject poverty, the ones without adequate housing, without a proper diet, and without access. Mom was always fun to be with. Halloween before the pandemic, Mom showed up at Amy's house. Amy lives on a street which closes down on Halloween, and every house is decorated. Mom was beautifully dressed as a monarch butterfly. The Secret Service were dressed casually but perfectly as Secret Service agents. She proceeded to go up and down the street with her grand and grandchildren and go trick-or-treating up and down and talk to people all over the street. She got back to Amy's and was so excited because she'd been out so much and nobody had recognized her. After Dad was put in hospice and my mother was racked with dementia, my siblings, my wife and I, would stay with them so that there would always be a family member around. One day, my mother was sitting with my wife, Becky, and she was reminiscing on what it was like to go to live in Hawaii. And she was talking about learning all the native dances. And she got up from the sofa, pushed her walker away, which she couldn't take a step without, and proceeded to do the hula for 2 or 3 minutes. She grabbed her walker, turned around, sat back on the sofa, and turned to my wife and said, "That's how you do it." I will always love my mother. I will cherish how she and Dad raised her children. They've given us such a great example of how a couple should relate. Let me finish by saying that my mother, Rosalynn Carter, was the most beautiful woman I've ever met, and pretty to look at too. Thank you.
I chose something that is hard to read without crying, so be patient. My mom spent most of her life in love with my dad. Their partnership and love story was a defining feature of her life. Because he isn't able to speak to you today, I am going to share some of his words about loving and missing her. This is from a letter he wrote 75 years ago while he was serving in the Navy. My darling, every time I have ever been away from you, I have been thrilled when I returned to discover just how wonderful you are. While I am away, I try to convince myself that you really are not, could not be, as sweet and beautiful as I remember. But when I see you, I fall in love with you all over again. Does that seem strange to you? It doesn't to me. Goodbye, darling. Until tomorrow. Jimmy.
Thank you all for being here. As you can see from the service, music was so important to my grandmother, and it's been just beautiful. So thank you. Governor and First Lady Kemp, thank you. Senators Warnock and Ossoff, thank you. Congress people, Mayor Dickens, thank you all. And again, a special thank you, Secretary Clinton, Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Obama, Mrs. Trump, and Dr. Biden. Thank you all for coming and acknowledging this remarkable sisterhood that you share with my grandmother. And thank you all for your leadership that you provided for our country and the world. Secretary Clinton and Dr. Biden, we also welcome your lovely husbands. I mean, this is a difficult day for my family, but we have been so enormously gratified by the love and support that we have felt from across the world. So thank you so much. And as Reverend Warnock told me, my grandmother doesn't need a eulogy. Her life was a sermon. And it was a mighty testament to the power of faith and to the power of a deep and determined love. And she lived this public love story that we all know of, that has inspired the world, including in these last days. And I think of all the things she accomplished, her most viral moment was when they were at a baseball game and the Braves put them on the kiss cam. And just like today, I mean, people were crying at the Braves game, you know. But we heard about it for years. It's amazing. But in my family, we all experienced those more private love stories. And she was my grandmother first. And she was like everyone else's grandmother in a lot of ways. Almost all of her recipes call for mayonnaise, for example. We all got cards from her on our birthdays, $20 bill in it. When I was 45, $20 bill. It's like, she was so down to earth, y'all. It was amazing. And one of the stories we've been talking about in my family these last few days is we were on a family trip and we were on a flight on Delta from here to somewhere, and we were all sitting in the back of the airplane together, and it took off, and we looked over. My grandmother took out this Tupperware of pimento cheese and this loaf of bread, and she just started making sandwiches. And she gave it to all of us grandkids and everyone else, and then she just started giving them to other people on the plane. And people were sitting there like, Rosalynn Carter just made me this sandwich, you know? And they couldn't believe it, but she loved people. And she was a cool grandma. She was cool, like, she did Tai Chi with this sword. And if you want to see a 5-year-old boy be excited, they would come back, Dad, you know Mom Carter has a sword, you know? She once told me about this trip, Papa, that y'all took to Havana in the 50s. She said, y'all went down there for the night and you didn't get a hotel room. And I said, what'd you do? She looked at me like, we danced. And we slept on the plane. They danced, didn't they? She was a rock for our family, and that's true, but in many ways she was more, as Chip said, an adventurer, a voyager, a mountain climber. She learned to ski in her 60s and then skied for 25 more years. As Chip said, she fished trout streams from Georgia to Wyoming and from Venezuela to Siberia, visited 120 countries, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Fuji, and summited peaks in Bolivia and other places. And I know that she went to the Everest base camp in Nepal. And I can guarantee you that she was looking up at that thing and thinking, if they would just let me. And based on what she did, I think she could have done it. She was born just a few years after women got the right to vote in this small town in the South where people were still plowing their fields behind mules. But she was made for these long journeys, and she was made to summit these mountains. As they said before, when she started in politics, she'd never talked to a group of people bigger than her Sunday school class. And then she elected a governor and a president. She shaped our national policies. She faced down dictators herself on issues of human rights. She built the Carter Center from an idea into a powerhouse for human rights. And as the chair of that board, I've watched her do it, and it's because she poured out her love. All over the world, and especially, as Kathy said, at the end of the road. Her 122 countries included Liberia and Mali and Sudan. And it was natural for her to open up her heart to those people, not with pity, but as partners. And she knew in those communities and recognized that ancient steel from rural women who carried their children and their communities on their backs. Whether they're from a 600-person town in South Georgia or South Sudan. As the song says, she knew what comes back when you give your love away. And for my grandmother, what came back was this unshakable strength and this powerful faith, and not just an abiding love, but a fierce, determined, adventurous love that sustained her on all of these long journeys. Journeys like Kathy mentioned of her guinea worm eradication, which has taken almost 40 years. But the Carter Center's unwavering efforts and their powerful partners in these tiny villages took a disease that affected 3.5 million people every year in the poorest parts of the world. And this year there won't be millions of cases, Papa. This year we've had 7 total cases. And we're in the last mile because she could see far, and she kept going. Was not afraid of these long journeys. Her advocacy for mental health was a 50-year climb that is as remarkable as any other, and has been mentioned already. But if you imagine just how far our society has come in the last 5 years on issues of mental health, and you think that she decided in 1970 to tackle the ancient stigma associated with mental illness. It is remarkable how far she could see and how far she was willing to walk. And that effort changed lives, and it saved lives, including in my own family. She was made for these long journeys. The Rosalynn Carter Institute helps caregivers because you can't journey alone. Even the Rosalynn Carter Butterfly Trail goes 3,000 gardens from Mexico to Canada, help monarch butterflies on their journeys. John Lewis once said that in all of his marches, he only really learned one thing: don't let them turn you around. That was my grandmother to a T. One of my last memories of her was in a hospital. We were there for my grandfather, but she had her own physical limitations that made it hard for her to walk. She had to practice. She was ready to go for one of these walks, and she picked up this cane. And I looked at the cane. She looked at me, and she said, "You know, it's not a cane." And I said, she said, "It's a trekking pole." She said, "It's the exact same kind that those women use when they go to the South Pole." I watched her walk down that hall, that trekking pole, and I followed her. And I just pray that we never lose sight of that path. Amen, and thank you.